Welcome back, everybody, to the Dry Dock episode 274, part 2. Of course, this is the second half of the November Patreon Dry Dock, so we shall continue as ever onwards with questions. And, well, this one's probably going to last about as long as the previous one, based on the number of questions I'm looking at in front of me. So, with all that said, let us begin. Andre Decoux asks, could you please describe briefly at least 3 instances where a naval officer went, "This is stupid," and then did the logical or sensible thing instead? Well, I think just a generalised award in this case has to go to Admiral Cunningham, because obviously if you've been following that particular series, as soon as he got to any kind of command responsibility rank, when he got orders that were patently and obviously dumb, and only going to make the situation worse, he just tended to go, right, into the fireplace filing cabinet they go, and just flat out ignored them. Obviously, the most recent example of that being, at the time that this is being recorded, when he was dealing with Admiral Godefroy in Alexandria, and, the Admiralty back home, although, as Admiral Cunningham said himself, he suspects that this was actually more of a political order, ordered him to get everything done and dusted that day before sunset. And he looked at the message and just went, well, it's after sunset here, so whoever wrote this clearly doesn't have an idea about time zones. Also, forcing the issue -2 hours ago is only going to result in a bloodbath, so I'm just going to ignore that. And then, obviously, at that point, being an admiral in a very delicate situation, told all of his captains, this is what they've said, and I'm going to ignore it. And everyone's like, yep, that sounds like a very good idea. Another example in the spirit of the question would be the dive bomber groups that attacked the Japanese carriers at Midway. Because theoretically, as it turned out, they were all going after one carrier, and then a bunch of them went, yeah, this seems like overkill, just going after a Kagi. And so a bunch of them went off after Kaga instead. And obviously that ended up in the destruction of both Akagi and Kaga. So rather than just playing blind follow the leader and really killing Akagi and leaving Kaga to potentially launch a counter-strike, they broke and did the sensible thing and took out both carriers. And again, a kind of collective award thing, I think, has to go to every officer who decided to take his ship off to join the free, insert name of his nation here, Navy in World War II. Because you've got to remember, there were lots and lots of countries that were invaded, Poland, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Greece, even some elements of the French fleet as well. And to varying degrees, you had officers look at the situation and go, okay, country's losing, country's been invaded, there either has been an official surrender or there's about to be, which technically speaking should involve our ships going over to into German control, or some kind of government is either being set up, puppet government under German administration, or that Germany's allowing to form, and they're going to say what they want us to do, which will be usually hand over your ships to Germany or neutralize them. And, vast numbers of officers went, no, this is utterly stupid, we're going to continue the fight, and just sailed off into the wild blue yonder, usually fetching up somewhere in the UK, and said, hey, we'd like to continue fighting Germany, please. Which was pretty much the logical and sensible thing to do, because as I pointed out in a variety of videos, by the time the Second World War actually properly kicks off with the invasion of Poland, nobody who has any degree of sanity left in their body is going to trust a single word that the Germans are saying, because the last few years at that point have just been a very long track record of Germany making agreements and then promptly breaking them as soon as it suits them. SMS Schleswig-Holstein asks, you mentioned that in the late 1800s the US Navy asked Congress to go from leftover Civil War scraps to almost Royal Navy in size. What were they asking for, and were there any weird designs that they were looking for in this new fleet? So the initial plan as drafted called for a fleet of, and exact numbers that we're talking about here vary slightly depending on what stage the plan was at, but anything up to 20 long-range first-class battleships, so essentially pre-dreadnoughts. Then somewhere, because the numbers depending on what stage of the plan you're on, either 10, 12, 15 or 20 of these long-range ships, and then anything from 15 to 20 to 25, again depending on the stage of the plan, short-range battleships, which are themselves subdivided into various categories of decreasing size. So the biggest of them would have two twin turrets with 13-inch guns, much like the long-range ships, and then there'd be smaller ones with 12-inch guns, and then the smaller ones still that would have a pair of 12-inch and a pair of 10-inch guns, and these would also have progressively shallower drafts. So the idea was that the biggest of the coastal range defense battleships would essentially be a small regular battleship, if you like, sort of like a little pocket-sized pre-dreadnought, just with a limited range. Then the next ones down would be kind of the upper end of coastal defense ships, and then the very smallest ones are actually also supposed to be capable of limited amounts of riverine warfare. So in the bigger rivers of the US, like the Mississippi, they should be able to sail up and down those. Exactly who they thought they were going to be fighting halfway up the Mississippi was never made entirely clear, but they were weird enough to just with that general design principle in place. And then, of course, they were looking at cruisers, they were looking at destroyers, torpedo boats, but also, strangely enough, given that this is the end of the 1880s, in the early 1890s, they were also looking at rams, which were, okay, the ram was a relatively recent concept, but by the middle of the 1890s, it had kind of had its day as a dedicated warship. And pretty much the ram craze as just a pure dedicated thing had come and gone during the late 1870s and through the 1880s, well, up to the end of the beginning of the 1880s. But the mid to late 1880s hadn't really seen dedicated rams like Polyphemus built, although then the US Navy happened to build Katydyn in the early 1890s, so maybe, they were still looking at that kind of thing, but who knows? It was a very weird plan anyway. What you did end up with were the Indiana class, one of which you can see here, albeit that the Indianas kind of grew out of the largest of the coastal defense ships rather than the longer range first class pre-dreadnoughts that were going to be the core of the fleet. Dave Collier asks, how did PT-109, commanded by Lieutenant John F. Kennedy, end up getting rammed and sunk? Did any other US Navy PT boats suffer this fate in World War II? The generally accepted consensus on PT-109 seems to be that it was part of a PT boat squadron that was assigned to try and intercept various Japanese destroyers. That much is not really beyond doubt. And their torpedoes, well, shockingly, didn't work very well, which is also not really a matter of contention. However, what then seems to have happened is that some of the PT boats had a very basic form of radar, but those PT boats and others in the squadron seem to have wandered off to do their own thing without actually telling the rest of the squadron, which meant that PT-109, amongst others, was kind of left to its own devices, at which point they decided, well, if we motor around at high speed, you would get in that part of the world a very phosphorescent wake, which would make you very easy to spot. And so PT-109 went on to kind of an idling mode to try and hide that. And then out of the darkness looms a big Japanese destroyer, which then according to its captain and various eyewitnesses, steers to ram PT-109, having spotted it and realised it's far too close to engage with guns. And, well, that's the end of PT-109. It gets hit, and the rather volatile fuel it has aboard goes kaboom. As far as other US Navy PT boats suffering the same fate, there are records of a number of US PT boats being sunk due to ramming. Exactly how many depends on which source you consult, because, looking through the various sources, I think a lot of it depends on how the particular person in question counts ramming. So sunk by ramming could mean stuff like PT-109 and mutual collisions between PT boats and everything in between. Others seem to take ramming as only rammed by the enemy, but then even within that, there's a subset of, was the PT boat sunk mostly or entirely by ramming, like 109, or was it rammed not incidentally, but as part of an overall amount of damage that was thrown at it, which collectively resulted in it sinking? So, for example, PT-509 was operating in Europe when it was shot up by a German vessel, which then rammed it to finish it off. So that would definitely count as being sunk by ramming. But I think, if I remember correctly, I think it's PT-27 which gets rammed by one of its own. And do you count that as a loss by ramming? And so the exact numbers seem to vary between 4 or 5 all the way up to 8 or 10 in one particular case. That was being a bit generous with what exactly counts as a loss by ramming. Randy Topeka asks, Admiral Yamamoto was a huge proponent for carrier warfare, knowing their influence on naval warfare. He was also the lead architect of the Battle of Midway. Knowing all this, why did he place himself in charge of the first battleship group way in the rear, leaving Nagumo in charge of the carrier strike group? Wouldn't he have been in a better position to control the battle from the carriers, and would it have made a difference if he had? Well, for a start, Admiral Nagumo was the admiral who was actually supposed to be in charge of the Kido Butai. He'd been in charge at Pearl Harbor, he was in charge now at Midway. Yamamoto deciding to go aboard Akagi and effectively take command overall Nagumo would have been a huge breach of protocol. And so, at that point, given that according to the plan, the battleships of the following force had a specific role to run down and destroy all surviving American ships, Yamamoto appears to have thought, well, they're fitted out as flagships. They're supposed to be taking part in the battle anyway. Everyone knows what the plan is. I'm not in charge of the Kido Butai, Nagumo is, so we might as well let Nagumo get on with the job. And hence you get the division that you do at Midway. Now, would he have been in a better position to control the battle from the carriers? Well, that's assuming, again, that he decided he was just going to override Nagumo and start issuing orders, which, as the superior ranking officer, he technically has the capability to, but again, it would be a huge breach of protocol to essentially imply that his highest ranking subordinate is incompetent and take over the battle halfway through Nagumo's command of it. But if either by that method or some other hand-wavy method, Yamamoto was in charge on the morning of the Battle of Midway instead of Nagumo in the Kido Butai, it probably would have made some difference, because of course Nagumo was following doctrine, and whilst to a certain extent Yamamoto would also follow doctrine, the part of the difference was that Nagumo was a high-ranking flag officer who had been taught what the doctrine of the Japanese Navy was. Yamamoto, to a fairly great degree, was one of the key officers who had made Japanese doctrine, and of course, being of a slightly higher rank, would also have a bit more operational freedom when it came to this kind of thing. So it's entirely possible that when he was faced with what most people identify as the sort of the key choice that Nagumo ended up making, one way that kind of sealed his fate, which was that when the reports of an American carrier or carriers came back from Tonei's aircraft, Nagumo decided he was going to recover all the aircraft he had coming back from Midway and then launch a strike against the American carriers, which of course didn't happen in the amount of force that it was supposed to, because in between that decision and the availability of his carrier flight decks once again, the American attack showed up, and that was that for most of the Kido Butai. Yamamoto, who was a somewhat less conservative admiral than Nagumo, and as we said, was of a higher rank anyway, he might well have chosen to immediately launch with what he had aboard and send those out before the strike package recovered back from Midway, at which point half of the Kido Butai's aircraft would have been winging their way over to the American fleet. That's not necessarily going to save the carriers per se, because the American aircraft are also already in the air, but given that they're on roughly reciprocal courses, the Japanese aircraft might spot the American aircraft going the other way, which would give more time for the combat air patrol to be alerted and get in position, and of course alert the Japanese carriers that they should get ready to defend themselves as well. And even if that doesn't happen, if the two columns of aircraft pass each other in completely separate areas of sky, the fact that all those armed and fueled aircraft are away and, not sitting in the hangars is probably going to help the chances of survival quite a bit, even if they are hit. Christopher Dooley asks, on ships of the line with differing weights of guns across the various decks, would the crews of the lighter guns on the upper decks be given different targets on an enemy ship than the heavier pieces below? Or was the general rule for all broadside guns to simply fire at whatever bits of French carpentry happened to be in front of the muzzle when the order is given, and do what damage they could? It depends. Generally speaking, most ship-of-the-line combat was two-deckers versus two-deckers, at which point you just fire into, well, not even necessarily fire into the hull, although you'd hopefully be aiming in that general direction. You'd just be firing at the ship in question from both gun decks. If you were a two-decker taking on a three-decker, then again, you'd just fire whatever you could at whatever you could aim at. But there were some circumstances where the lighter guns on the higher decks might be given different targets. And that would be if you were on the actual upper decks as opposed to the upper gun deck. The guns on the quarter deck, on the poop deck, etc., in the forecastle, those guns might well be given orders to either load grape shot to take out large numbers of the enemy ship's crew whilst the main gun deck batteries were blasting away at the hull, or they might be aimed at very specific targets if they had skilled gunners to try and take out mast, take out the ship's wheel, etc., etc. And in the cases of first-rate ships of the line, like Victory here, taking on third-rate ships of the line with two gun decks, then of course the upper gun deck of Victory, depending on the size of the third rate in question, may well be in a position where that upper gun deck can scythe across the upper deck, the open deck of the enemy two-decker, at which point then it makes a certain degree of sense, if you've got the time, let's say you've discharged a broadside already, to order the upper gun deck to load with grape shot, star shot, bar shot, chain shot, etc., even whilst the lower guns are aiming with, standard round shot. Although, even with all of that, quite often it can just be a case of fire on whatever things you can shoot at. The almighty Hypnotoad asks, what is the earliest date a true ironclad, or any type of metal-clad vessel, could be a viable warship? Could an early vessel such as Mary Rose have been made into one? Or would you have to wait until the mid-1800s, as historically these vessels first appeared at that point? From a purely manufacturing perspective, you could make an ironclad or copperclad or bronzeclad vessel pretty much whenever you wanted. I mean, there are accounts of Viking ships being at least partially clad with iron plates, mostly around the bow. And, the French had the armoured floating batteries in the 1850s. The main issue is going to be the industry to produce this metal armor and how thick you're making it, because obviously you've got people capable of making very sophisticated sheet metal defenses in the 12th 13th century. You've even got things like Lorica segmentata back in the Roman period, but the question is, what are you trying to protect against? If you're trying to protect against spears, arrows, rocks, etc., in the pre-gunpowder period, well, the wooden hull does a pretty decent job of that for the most part. Once you get into the gunpowder period, you do have to get a certain thickness of iron in place to have meaningful protection against incoming fire. Now, of course, you could do the approach that the Americans took in the American Civil War with a lot of their ships, which is just to get a bunch of thinner plates and bolt them all together. That would be doable. But is less efficient than a single plate, whether that be rolled or hammered. So it could be done, in theory. The big problem is going to be how you're going to get around, because, of course, adding all this heavy iron to your ship is going to significantly increase the weight of the ship, at which point you need a much finer length to beam ratio and or steam propulsion to help you get around. A relatively tubby sail-powered only vessel covered in iron plate is going to be excruciatingly slow, at which point you could make this kind of sort of invincible sail-powered ironclad, but everyone would probably just laugh at you because they'd just sail away from you and go off and do something else, and you can't really stop them because you can't catch them. Riva asks, it seems that in the war in the Pacific in World War II, the Japanese had multiple engagements in which they engaged US forces, managed to, one way or another, get the drop on US forces and American warships at a critical disadvantage after a violent engagement, but then they turn around in what could very well have been their moment of victory had they pushed on to finish the job that they were seeking to do. Was there some sort of institutional training or doctrinal issue that left them so reluctant to follow through on the brave actions they'd just undertaken, or was it just a fluke that commanders kept turning back, even in what were arguably supposed to be death or glory assaults? Personally, I think the Kantai-Kessen doctrine has an awful lot to answer for in these circumstances, because, I mean, we mentioned in the first part of this dry dock the fact that crew experience and, by extension, aggressiveness makes a huge difference when it comes to the outcomes of a lot of battles. But I think it goes a lot wider, even up to an institutional level of, yes, theoretically practicality might say this, and yes, doctrine might say this, but what is your sort of core heritage, your core culture as a Navy telling you to do at that point? And ultimately, that culture, which influences crew action, can have huge effects one way or the other. So you look at the evacuation of Crete. By all logical inferences, Admiral Cunningham should have pulled his ships back from Crete to preserve them for later fights. But he didn't see it that way. He saw it that the Royal Navy had a tradition, and he was going to stick to that tradition, and that meant he was going to do his level best to evacuate as many people from Crete as he could, even if it cost him a bunch of his ships. Because, as he said, it takes 3 years to build a ship, it takes 300 to build a tradition. And he was conscious of the fact that, yes, he might lose ships, but ultimately, the UK, the British Empire, could build new ones. And to a certain extent, when you look at various American actions. Now, obviously, in 1942, especially in the Guadalcanal campaign, the US is going through ships of all shapes and sizes rather faster than it would prefer. But I think at the back of most American commanders' minds is still going to be a general feeling that they obviously don't want to lose their ship, but if they do, there will ultimately be more of them. Whereas with the Kantai-Kessen doctrine, it was very, actually surprisingly conservative about husbanding the resources of the Japanese Navy as much as humanly possible up until the final decisive battle. And again, this is a personal observation, but I think that's, to me, seems to be at the core of a lot of the sort of snatched defeat from the jaws of victory moments that some Japanese commanders underwent. Now, some of them, there are more mundane explanations. Mikawa turning back because he's worried about airstrikes is a legitimate reason to turn back. We know in hindsight that the American carriers weren't anywhere near and there and couldn't have done anything about it, but he wasn't to know that. He didn't have the correct intel. Of course, you can then start making a sort of a value judgment of would the loss of his ships, even if there were carriers aircraft available to finish him off in the morning, would that be offset by destroying the transport fleet and thus quite possibly leading to the Americans being driven off of Guadalcanal? Well, from hindsight, it probably would have been worth it. But at the time, you have this whole thing of, you must preserve your ships for the decisive battle. So when you find yourself in a situation of, well, I could press on, but it's going to potentially increase the risks my vessels are being put at, or I could call it a day and say, well, we have won a limited victory here and all my ships are ready to fight another battle. Well, when you've got drumming in the back of your head, ships must be preserved for the decisive battle, ships must be preserved for the decisive battle, that's going to tip you more towards the idea of a withdrawal in good order than it is to go forward and fight to the very last. Again, my personal theory on that. Greg M. asks, your excellent series on the Spanish Armada lists ships with names that are famous from their 20th century incarnation, such as Ark Royal, Dreadnought, Lion, Revenge, Victory. There are 300 plus years between the Armada and the 20th century's famous namesakes. During those 300 years, were there intermediate ancestors of these or other famous 20th century Royal Navy ship names that have especially illustrious but perhaps otherwise less well-known histories? Well, of course, there is HMS Indefatigable, which would be known in the 20th century for being both the Indefatigable class battle cruiser sunk at Jutland, as well as one of the Implacable class aircraft carriers in World War II. But her origins were Indefatigable, the Razaid third-rate ship of the line, turned into a heavy frigate, which, of course, captained by Captain Pellew historically, but sort of popularized by the Hornblower series as well. So, that's an origin. There wasn't any Indefatigable at the Armada, but it's an ancestor of a well-known set of 20th century ships with histories that reach back beyond that. Dreadnought has multiple iterations between the Armada and the 20th century, a couple of the notable ones being a second-rate Dreadnought, as in a 98-gunner, that fought at the Battle of Trafalgar, and then two Dreadnoughts after that was kind of the third wheel of turret ships. You have Devastation and Thunderer, being the first sailless battleships, but then you have Dreadnought, or originally Fury, which was a improvement on that design as well, sailing around in the 1870s and 1880s. Revenge is another ship with a long history in the Royal Navy, but as with Dreadnought, Revenge had a descendant-ancestor fighting at Trafalgar. And a little bit of a left fielder, the Defiance was one of those little ships that went out and challenged the Armada right at the very start. Defiance would also see a version of itself fighting at Trafalgar once again, and then Defiance, although there wasn't a Defiance in service of the Royal Navy during World War One and World War Two, there was a defiance in the 20th century, and that was the torpedo school. Paul Pimblott asks, could the Germans have successfully invaded Norway during the First World War? And if so, how do you see this affecting the naval war of World War One? For instance, could they have used their battle cruisers to launch raids into the Atlantic on merchant shipping? No, I don't think they could. Objectively, could the Germans have physically sailed enough men over to Norway to challenge Norway and invade it? Theoretically, yes, they have enough merchant ships to do so, and they've got enough soldiers. But where are these soldiers going to come from? Because every 10,000 soldiers you go off to invade Norway with are 10,000 less soldiers on one of your many front lines. Which one are you going to denude of quite a few quite valuable men? Another thing is that whilst by World War II, with aircraft and all sorts of things going on, Norway's defences were a little bit outmoded. Whilst the Norwegian coastal battleships aren't really going to stand up to the full might of the High Seas Fleet, the shore defences, including Oscarburg Fortress, and the coastal defence ships, etc., are considerably more modern in World War One than they would be in World War Two. So there's a potential for the Norwegians to put up a bit more of a fight. And on top of that, of course, you have the fact that for most of World War One, the Royal Navy is able to read German naval codes, and any invasion that the Germans are planning is going to require an awful lot of pre-planning, which people are going to become aware of. And then, when you sail your large contingent of troops over on transport ships, or I guess maybe stick them on the High Seas Fleet itself, that's the Royal Navy's dream come true, because they would know where you're going. So there's going to be a very limited number of courses that you can take, and if you're sailing with a bunch of troop transport ships, which, let's face it, inevitably you probably are going to have to, because even if you decided to take the men themselves on the warships, you are going to need a large transport fleet for all the supplies. And realistically speaking, just in case you end up in combat, you don't really want your decks crowded with a bunch of soldiers. At which point, you've now tied the High Seas Fleet into a destination, which the British know. You've tied them to a slow speed because of the transport fleet, which the British will also know. And you've tied yourself to venturing considerably far north, which the British can be absolutely delighted with. At which point the Grand Fleet is going to show up and just be like, yes, please tie yourself to a distinct physical location and or a very slow transport fleet. We would absolutely love for you to do that. In fact, why don't you go up one of the fjords and begin your attack, and we'll just wait out here at the entrance for you to try and come back out. So, could the Germans have tried to invade Norway? Yes. Would they have been successful? I severely doubt it. Brad Bargmeyer asks, we of course like the history of capital ships and related battles, but they're expensive and relatively few are built. So few that the South Pacific in World War II saw battles between Japanese barges and American PT boats. What proportion of naval warfare is actually these kinds of small combatants versus capital ships? I think there are two ways of reading that question, so I'm going to try and briefly cover both. One way, I suppose, would be what proportion of naval warfare is these small combatants versus as in fighting against capital ships, the answer being relatively little, because when you're talking about PT boats and MTBs, MGBs, E-boats, S-boats, etc., with the best will in the world, when they try normally to go after capital ships, they tend to fail, and fail rather horribly, and it ends with lots of them being blown to pieces, because they're very fragile. Now, of course, there are the occasional exceptions, like the Battle of Surigao Strait, but they are very much the exception. The other aspect, I guess the way of interpreting the question would be what proportion of naval warfare is actually involving things like barges, MTBs, S-boats, PT boats, etc., versus how much of naval warfare involves capital ships slugging it out. And again, well, obviously there are going to be significantly more PT boat small craft engagements because there's just a lot more of them. They're viewed, frankly, as a bit more expendable, and so they tend to go flitting around and doing quite a lot of on and off what I guess you'd call skirmishing to a certain degree, as well as going after transports and that kind of thing, depending on the theatre of war. However, they are a limited force. They have a short range, they have a short endurance, even beyond the fuel range. They have a very limited weapons payload, they're very fragile, and they can't really handle the really, really heavy deep oceanic seas, which means that their operational positions are going to be somewhat limited, and thus, while there may be a lot of them, you're going to tend to find that as a whole, cruisers and destroyers will see a lot more of naval warfare than the small craft will. That's not to say the small craft won't see lots of engagements, but they'll see lots of small engagements in relatively limited areas of scope, whereas the larger ships can see action across the entire scope of the combat theatre, including in the deep ocean. Reichspear Minister asks, on tanks and planes, crew ergonomics are an important factor to the overall ability to fight. Were crew ergonomics, except for shell handling, ever factored in on surface combat vessels? If yes, how, and could you give some examples? Yep, well, as we discussed in the previous half of this week's dry dock, you've got ergonomics around turrets and their interiors, even if they are somewhat cramped, but there are a few other factors that have to be considered when it comes to crew ergonomics. For example, the location of officers. Again, as mentioned when it came to the sternwalk question, historically officers' cabins were right aft, partly because of the comfort, but partly also because that meant they were the closest to the command areas. As time went on and the command areas became further and further forward, the officers' quarters would eventually end up being further and further forward until they're basically in the same superstructure as the bridge stack is. You've also got the layout of secondary and anti-aircraft armament, partially for stability, but partially also, the ergonomics of these things are being operated by human crew. Human crew don't tend to do very well when subjected to massive amounts of overpressure from the blast of other guns. So whilst it might be very, very tempting to build a big pyramid of firepower in the middle of your ship, the fact is that the only people who are going to be enjoying that are the people right up the very top, and everybody else that has, 15 barrels going off over their heads is probably just going to curl up and wait to die after about the first 10 seconds. And so you have to space your guns out. And that sometimes might mean finding inventive places to put them, like on top of turrets, and putting your big heavy stuff, not just for stability reasons, but for these human comfort reasons, right on the edges of the ship instead of, say, on the center line, because whilst that does offer you a lot more in your terms of your arc of fire, it also means that pretty much everything within that arc of fire can't be a manned gun, unless, of course, you stick it on a nice high pedestal behind one of your main turrets. Nick Brodar asks, I've read several sources which claim that Jutland is the only doctrinal dreadnought battleship battle, where massed battle fleets lined up and slugged it out. I cannot recall any other such engagements. Do you know of any? The World War II battleship versus battleship fights seem more like wheeling cruiser actions with a few units on each side, rather than massed battle fleet slugfests. You know what, I had to think about this for a while, and I think you might be right. Because there are a number of other engagements where you have dreadnoughts or battle cruisers fighting it out in World War I and World War II. But if you want to define doctrinal as in mass battle, it's lining up and knocking seven bells out of each other, yeah, Jutland's pretty much the only one. Everything else is much smaller elements of various fleets, and they say small unit actions, or even where one side has formed a line like at Surigao Strait, the other side very definitely hasn't. And even with Dogger Bank, which has enough ships on both sides, it might qualify. The fact is, one side was making for the hills as fast as humanly possible. Gallias of Martinengo asks, watching the channels of the museum ships Texas and New Jersey, the need to dry dock the ships every 25 to 30 years is a very costly undertaking. would it not be more cost effective to build a permanent cofferdam around those ships instead? There's a lot of factors that go into it. Part of it is that if you build a cofferdam outside of very specific circumstances, you're probably never going to move that ship again. And that can have some fairly major implications if you ever end up needing major structural repairs. Another is your location. Will the river or port authority that you happen to be on actually allow you to do that? So in the case of Texas, they haven't settled on exactly where they're going, so who knows with that. But certainly in the case of New Jersey, I suspect the Delaware River Authority would not be in favour of any kind of cofferdam proposal. And then you've also got to take into account that when you're looking at budget items, building a full cofferdam system, even if you do have permission to do so, is going to be quite expensive. And that in and of itself isn't actually repairing the ship. So you've got to justify this to whoever's signing off all the bills, because they're going to be paying out an awful lot of money without immediately extending the lifespan of the ship. And at some point, that ship is still going to need repairs. And that kind of ties into what I said previously about the fact the ship is probably not going to move again. If you do need to do repairs, like they're doing to USS North Carolina, you can see here, yes, you can drain the cofferdam, but what's the ground conditions under there going to be like? Just because it works in one location doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work in another. And is that ground going to provide enough support to the ship's structure that it's safe to drain it? Where, of course, obviously with dry docks, you've got dry dock blocks and everything else to help support it. And even if it is, if there's a leak, let's say right next to the keel, and you've got a ship like this in a cofferdam, draining it's not going to help you because you won't be able to get at the keel. Now, in theory, kind of a best of all worlds approach would be a kind of gated cofferdam. Essentially, you're just building a dry dock, but without the base. You would have to do some dredging for a while to make sure it's deep enough. But in theory, that would give you all the advantages of a cofferdam, but by being able to open it, you would then be able to take the ship out to dry dock, perhaps at a slightly more extended cycle. But that comes back to who's going to pay for all that, because at that point you're paying for the cofferdam and some bunch of movable gates and still periodic, if somewhat extended, dry docking. It is unfortunately, there is no easy answer to preserving these ships. Certainly not the big ones, anyway. Snowstalker36 asks, are there any failed ship classes that found new life? Immediately thinking of Furious, Courageous, and Glorious. Well, it might be a little controversial, but to a certain extent, I'd be tempted to assign the Lexington class to that category, because, as some of you probably already know, I really do not rate the Lexingtons in their battlecruiser configuration at all. They seem to have completely missed the lessons of the Invincibles and Indefatigables when it came to operating in an environment where there are other battlecruisers, whereas they made absolutely brilliant carriers. I mean, technically you could probably also put the Leanders and the Arethusas into that category, because they were mostly supposed to go on trade protection, especially the Arethusas. As it turned out, they very rarely, if ever, actually got assigned to those missions, and instead a lot of them got stuck on frontline duty in the Mediterranean. But they did surprisingly well there. So, I'm not sure if it's an entirely failed class in that respect, because there's nothing wrong with the ships themselves. They just weren't given the mission that they were ostensibly originally put together for. Brandon Minders asks, was any ship in the Age of Steam and Steel dismasted? And if not, why was the US so nervous that it invented the cage mast concept? Well, there wasn't a huge amount of capital ship on capital ship action that was kind of to the death during the age of iron and then steam and steel. Obviously, you have battles like Lissa and so forth, but by the time the US is introducing cage masts, it's pre-Tsushima, so you don't have that to go by. There's not really a huge amount of dismasting going on, but what is going on is two factors. Firstly, the introduction of rangefinders and early fire control equipment, which is obviously rapidly evolving, is now coming about. When that occurs, suddenly masts become a lot more important, because the masts that remained on capital ships, and, well, cruisers for that matter as well, in the latter part of the 19th century had essentially just become somewhere to stick your signal flags, and then as you got into the 20th century, maybe your radio antenna, good place to run your laundry from, that kind of thing. But there wasn't a huge amount really doing with it. Yeah, you could have a crow's nest or some other kind of spotting top, and in the early pre-dreadnought age, maybe even fighting platforms. But as far as critical ship systems go, apart from a support bit for flags, not really much else. But now, a key and vital part of your entire ship's capability to shoot at long distance, with the rangefinders and fire control systems, is now going to have to be mounted quite high up for obvious long distance visibility reasons. Except that requires, because of the weight, some rather heavy tripod masts, as opposed to the rather thin pole masts that you see on some 1880s and 1890s ships. And now you have a lot of weight high up, which is a stability issue. So that's one thing, and the cage masts, ostensibly in their initial forms, promised to be a bit lighter, so it's a weight-saving measure. But at the same time, they do have history to look back on, and the last time ships with masts, where the masts were relatively important, fought in fairly major conflicts, dismasting was actually something of a problem. And of course, if you are dismasted and your fire control and rangefinders go down with it, you're a bit stuffed, because now you can't shoot a long distance and the enemy can. Which brings in the other element of the cage mast, which is, theoretically, a shell can pass through the cage mast and not cause it to collapse, whereas a shell that hits a tripod mast could very well cause it to collapse. Of course, the flip side is a cage mast is a slightly larger target, so it's more likely to be hit than a tripod mast, but, heads or tails kind of coin toss on that one. So essentially it's a combination of weight saving and trying to get ahead of the game on what the US saw as a vulnerability for the newly fangled spotting and fire control areas. Silder and Machine Works asks, I've often been amused at how people tried to exploit or create loopholes in things, and you've mentioned how various countries tried to find ways around the various naval treaties. I was looking at the Washington Naval Treaty and noticed there is a clause for the replacement of ships lost in accidents. Has anybody ever attempted or planned to attempt to abuse this loophole and accidentally sink Arkansas, Iron Duke, etc., on a training exercise in order to get themselves a shiny new warship early? Would there be any way for other nations to investigate such an accident and determine if it was intentional? I don't think anyone attempted to try and get rid of a ship that way. Apart from anything, it would be a write-off there compared to scrapping it or whatever. You wouldn't get any money back for it. But, there's a lot of very complex issues with trying to plan something like that. I mean, for one thing, there's a very real risk that servicemen will die, because any accident that's bad enough to write the ship off, like going aground or a magazine detonation or ripping itself open on a rock and sinking, that's going to cost lives, and it would be a very amoral person who would decide that they were prepared to sacrifice completely innocent people's lives just for the sake of getting a shiny new ship built slightly earlier. And the thing is, if you engineered it in such a way that nobody died, that in and of itself would probably raise red flags, because ships don't tend to go and get wrecked without people dying. So you've got a bit of a catch-22 there. Then you've also got to take into account that you've got to damage the ship badly enough for it to not be repairable. So you've got to say, look, there is no way this thing's ever coming back into service. We're just going to have to replace it. Then you've also got to figure out if your equivalent of the Treasury is actually going to pay for a replacement, or are you just going to end up with some opportunistic politician going, oh, well, I guess that's one less ship off the maintenance budget, and then refusing to expand the Navy. And of course, if you get the politicians in on it, then, well, yeah, good luck keeping that a secret. And on top of all of that, if you want to maintain even a vague degree of plausibility for all of this, whoever's in charge of that ship is going to have their career absolutely ruined, which means you're going to have to get them on board with it and come up with some kind of backhanded deal to compensate them for it, which again increases the complexity and the chances of being found out. Or you're going to have to do complete, moustache-twirlingly evil and try and engineer the thing without any of the crew or the officer in charge knowing what you're doing. At which point you're talking about, probably things like relying on the vagaries of weather systems and deliberately messing with their ability to navigate or something like that. Various things that it's just far too complicated. And if such a thing did occur, and there were some very blatant red flags, obviously everyone would call shenanigans on that. Though, as with most of the enforcement elements of the treaty system, such as they were, it would be a bit difficult for the other parties to specifically investigate to themselves, because obviously it would be a sovereign matter. Hi Bacon Bomb asks, so nowadays navies from around the world come and participate in RIMPAC every few years. Were there ever any naval exercises where multiple nations came together to participate, and what were the general reactions to this? Not that I'm particularly aware of, mostly because the kind of massive global spanning alliance system that leads to, dozen plus countries sending representatives in terms of their naval strength to a RIMPAC style exercise really didn't exist in peacetime before the 20th century. You would have the occasional alliance, and occasionally there might be a joint exercise between two close allies, but that would be very rare because, alliances between two very large powers with major navies were pretty rare. You did get slightly more diverse coalitions being built up in times of war, like the various coalitions that Britain put together to fight the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. But obviously those are put together during a time of war and they tend to dissolve after war. So if you do have multiple nations shipping all coming together to fight on the same side, it tends to be in a time of conflict, not in a RIMPAC style peacetime exercise. You can look at the post-Napoleonic War part of the first part of the 19th century for things like that, where you have the Crimean War against the Russians and various fights against the Ottomans and so on and so forth, where you have 3 or 4 different navies all showing up and cooperating, but it is wartime, not peacetime. Lord Quack, King of the Ducks, asks, for the early aircraft carriers, there was a lot of experimentation with funnel layout and location. Could you give a brief rundown of the ideas that were tried and of the methods tried, which was the best option that wasn't just running it up the island as later carriers did? Well, in testing and or implementation, there was, of course, the very early leave the stack exactly where it is, as you can see here with Furious in her forward flight deck only configuration. This turned out to be a very bad idea because even when they eventually put flight deck on her aft section, the turbulence caused by the funnel structure itself and the hot exhaust gases was awful for aircraft coming into land. When they were developing HMS Eagle, they looked at various layouts, including having an island on either side of the flight deck with funnels coming up on both sides. So basically smaller thinner islands with smaller, thinner funnels. You also had an approach like they did with HMS Furious, which was to trunk the funnels right aft and exhaust it under the back end of the flight deck, which sort of maybe kind of worked, except for the fact that by having all the trunking internal to the ship, you ended up with a massively reduced hangar deck space. You could also try a similar trunking effect, but with the trunking mostly outside the ship, which preserved your hangars. But generally speaking, that kind of exhaust system was very big, took up a lot of weight, and it turned out, especially as aircraft got larger and heavier and needed to come in on longer, more shallow approaches, it was still dumping a bunch of exhaust gas rising up into the path of incoming aircraft. You also had the attempts that the Japanese made when you look at the early version, for example, of Akagi, where they had the funnel come up roughly where you would expect there to be an island conventionally, but then they had the funnel trunked over and down to try and exhaust all of the hot gases into the water and away from the ship. That kind of worked to a certain degree, albeit there were hazards when the ship was rolling and so forth. And you had USS Ranger's system, where things were trunked back, not in massive sort of single trunks like Furious had, even in her eventual full flat top form, but in slightly smaller individual trunks, which then came out of a series of funnels most of the way to the back, and which could then be lowered to lie horizontal to direct the exhaust gases further away from the ship. And although the somewhat more complicated system, and again having the problem of having extensive trunking from the boiler rooms running aft, and thus weight, etc., that also kind of worked to a certain degree. Biggles of the Fleet Air Arm asks, in a dry dock in the low 90s somewhere, you noted that although a terrible level naval bomber, the HE-111 was a relatively decent torpedo bomber. Could you discuss this a bit, please? Numbers, theaters, years active, biggest victim, typical target, etc., etc. There were a few different attempts to turn the HE-111 into a torpedo bomber, some of which were more successful than others. A few of them really didn't go very well at all, but various versions of the HE-111H were the ones that turned out to generally work the best as torpedo bombers. As you can see in this picture with this particular HE-111, they could carry 2 torpedoes, which is of course twice as many as your average torpedo bomber, which is quite helpful. And the HE-111 had relatively decent low-level performance, which is important for a torpedo bomber. Of course, being a twin-engine bomber, it also had good range, which was important, and a relatively decent defensive armament, certainly compared to torpedo bombers that would usually have 1 or 2 rear-facing guns, and that was probably about it. Of course, it was a bigger and somewhat less agile target, which factored against that. And it's a smaller aircraft, actually, than the G4M, which we know the Japanese used as a torpedo bomber to a fairly great extent. In terms of the years active and the theaters it was in, the main successful torpedo variant, as I say, the H variant, mostly was used against merchant shipping, convoys, especially in the Arctic, but also in other environments as well. You'd find them in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, as well as in the Arctic. The H variants were produced from kind of 41-ish onwards. Now, they didn't really bag any particularly prestigious victims, and there are a few dozen of them in operation at any one time, but they did participate in some fairly important, fairly famous actions, the attack on convoy PQ-17 being the most obvious one. They also had a good shot at PQ-18, although it cost them a fair number of aircrew. The HE-111 was also competing with the Ju-88, the can-do-anything German aircraft, for the role of torpedo bomber. And objectively, the Ju-88 was a better aircraft. It's just the HE-111 wasn't terrible at it. The main thing, to be honest, that hampered German aerial torpedo operations more than anything else was simply the fact they didn't have particularly good set of aerial torpedoes. Certainly not compared to, well, any of the other major navies, US, British, Japanese, etc., involved in the fight. German aerial torpedoes tended to be a little bit lacking in operational reliability and speed, and that probably as much as anything contributed to the gradual whittling down of the HE-111 torpedo bomber units, because they would have to risk getting a lot closer to get any kind of reliable torpedo drop on their opponents, as opposed to, other nations' torpedo bombers, which could drop from further out, either because with the Americans later in the war they developed ways of dropping from higher and faster, or just simply because their torpedoes would run faster, and so it was easier to drop them further out and still do the geometry that was necessary to estimate the launch angle so that you'd get a hit. Elliot W. James asks, the Italians built 10 Garibaldi-class armoured cruisers for various nations. Why was the design so successful, and what were the strengths and weaknesses of the design? As a wargamer, I found that the 4 8-inch is more effective than the 1 10-inch and 2 8-inch main armament version. It's a combination of two main factors. Firstly, the Italians were willing to actually, build and sell these ships. When you look at the various nations that are building armoured cruisers at this point, the British at the start of the Garibaldi's construction run are not building armoured cruisers. The French are building 1 or 2. The Russians are building 1 or 2. And the Americans are looking at them. But realistically, the Italians are the only ones who are in the process of building a significant number. And obviously, as their construction program goes on through into the early part of the 20th century, the British start building their own armoured cruisers again. The French step up their building efforts, but the Italians are just consistently available. So that's one factor. It's just, you can buy these. You can't really buy a design from Britain if Britain isn't building any. Another factor is that they're just really good designs. Now, there are, as you said, there are strengths and weaknesses, but for what they are, the Garibaldis are a really, really decent armoured cruiser. And if you compare them to the contemporary French armoured cruisers, for example, the French armoured cruisers typically have a pair of 7.6-inch guns as their main armament, and they tend to be somewhat on the small side at this point. So if you're comparing buying a French-designed armoured cruiser of roughly similar to what the French Navy is ordering at the time, the Garibaldi is a little bit bigger and significantly more powerful, because if you go with the twin 8-inch option, which I agree would be the better alternative, then you effectively have double the equivalent main gun firepower, and secondaries, etc. It's all pretty much a wash. So if you were going to buy French or Italian, well, the Italian is just the better design. And then if halfway through, when the British come in, you look at what the British are building, which would be the Cressy class. And if you compare the Garibaldis to the Cressys, the Garibaldis are about 55-60% the displacement, so they're a considerably smaller ship. And you would normally expect that to come with a lot of compromises, but in actual fact, the Garibaldis on average are only about a knot slower than the Cressys, so not a huge issue really there. Because they're so much smaller, they can get away with a much, much smaller power plant, which means less fuel consumption, less crew demands, etc., which is going to be especially important for a smaller navy. And armament-wise, they're really not that far removed from each other. The Cressys have a pair of 9.2-inch guns, singles, so, you either have double that number of guns but slightly smaller with the 8-inch, or a similar number of guns with the single 10s, and then, depending on the variant of the Garibaldi you go for, you can have about as many 6-inch guns as a Cressy, and your tertiary, etc. armament is also roughly similar. You actually have slightly more torpedo tubes. And then you look at protection. At their maximum protection, the Garibaldis and the Cressys are about the same on the belt. Granted, the Cressys have somewhat better deck protection, But when you look at the turrets and the barbettes, etc., again, the protection is pretty much the same. So what you're getting is very nearly as fast, essentially as well armed, and just has slightly less deck armor, but otherwise is broadly comparable to a ship that's almost double its size. And, you might be thinking, okay, well, why then is the British ship so much bigger? Well, range, basically. So, okay, it's not quite as long range, but then if you're not Britain and you don't have a global spanning empire to defend, you look at the customers of the Garibaldis. You got, obviously, the Regia Marina. At the time, they're concentrated pretty much in the Mediterranean. The Argentine Navy, again, pretty much confined to Argentine waters, facing off against Chile and Brazil. The Imperial Japanese Navy, slightly wider range of action compared to just its own coast, but still confined to sort of the Sea of Japan and adjacent nearby areas. They're not going into different oceans for the most part. And the Spanish Navy, okay, the Spanish Navy is somewhat more far-flung, but then when you look at their deployments to the Caribbean and the Philippines, they tend to just go from point A to point B and then stick around that place, as opposed to the British who just bounce around all over the planet, at which point the range doesn't matter so much. And for all that, you've got a smaller number of crew aboard, so they're cheaper to run. So, yeah, they're pretty much the perfect armoured cruiser for a small to medium-sized navy. You'd be very hard-pressed, I think, especially on just under 7,000 tons normal displacement, to come up with an armoured cruiser that's much better. So they're just a superb little product for their time, and understandably are very popular. October Nid asks, what is the most plausible scenario for a carrier battle in the Atlantic? And is it Langley versus Bern? Well, considering that by the time the US enters the war, Langley is a seaplane tender, unfortunately not. The most plausible scenario for a carrier battle in the Atlantic obviously involves a little bit of alternate history shenanigans, but given how close Graf Zeppelin came to being completed, even with some of the delays that occurred before the long-term delays were put in, I think if you're going to have any kind of carrier battle in the Atlantic, it would require Graf Zeppelin to be completed, i.e., while she's fitting out, there's no interruptions in her fitting out. They take her all the way up to being a completed carrier, and then whether she deploys along with surface raiders or as a surface raider on her own, given her design speed, then obviously one of the ways you would try and find a carrier would be with your own carrier aircraft, and then depending on when she deploys into the Atlantic, she may be facing off against British carriers, or she may be facing off against American carriers, or she may be facing off against a combination of both. It depends. Does she sail in 1941, 42, 43, etc.? George Robert asks, you've said something along the lines of Britain was ill-served by Admiral Beatty when he was with the fleet cosplaying Nelson, but well-served by him at the Admiralty later on as a politician. I think I have a reasonable grasp of the former, but I'm missing the latter. Could you tell us something about his successes as First Sea Lord? It's an important qualifier to start with. Beatty did better as First Sea Lord than he did at sea. That is, however, a relatively low bar to clear, but nonetheless, there are a few things that you can credit him with. In the 1920s as a whole, which he was First Sea Lord for most of it, he can generally be credited for fighting the Navy's corner pretty hard in a period when the Treasury was desperately trying to cut every single penny from anything that it could possibly get its hand on, as it usually does. And thanks to his political connections, he was somewhat more successful at resisting a lot of those cuts than a large majority of his contemporaries might otherwise have been. He was also responsible for persuading the government to continue the production of the County-class cruisers, because that was a big ticket item on the chopping block the government wanted to cut down on the number of those. And given that after the counties you'd only get York and Exeter, if Beatty hadn't fought his corner as hard as he did, then when you enter World War II, Britain may well have found itself with an extreme shortage of heavy cruisers. I mean, they needed more than they had, but at least they had a relatively decent production run of the counties to throw at this problem. And so between, fighting the corner for the Royal Navy and therefore keeping morale up in the Navy, making sure they had at least a reasonable number of heavy cruisers, that's a pretty decent outcome for Beatty, by, as I said, mostly by manipulating his political contacts and refusing to back down quite a bit. There's also the matter of the Fleet Air Arm. Now, he does get flack for allowing the Fleet Air Arm to be, or the Royal Navy Air Service as it was, to be absorbed into the RAF. However, he became First Sea Lord a year after the RAF was formed, and he did try and get the Fleet Air Arm back, but wasn't able to do so. So that, as a criticism of him, is probably a little bit unfair. He did his best. It wasn't enough to get the Fleet Air Arm back under Royal Navy control, but he wasn't ultimately responsible for losing that control in the first place. And when it came to the Washington Treaty, although obviously Britain had to give up being the dominant naval power at sea, the Royal Navy under Beatty's leadership was able to claw back some opportunities, which, okay, fair enough, the government then didn't exploit, but they were still there. Theoretically, the Treasury, as it ever does, would have loved to slash Royal Navy spending considerably more than what the Washington Treaty allowed for, but by managing to get the Americans, well, to be fair, the Americans proposed initially parity between the Royal Navy and the US, but by essentially persuading everyone else that this was the thing to go for, more at home than abroad, it meant that the Royal Navy could actually be maintained at a larger size than the Treasury wanted. And also, I think the main success, although possibly also the biggest missed opportunity in latter years, was the fact that pretty much all of the powers except Britain wanted regulations on cruiser tonnage. And they specifically wanted regulations on cruiser tonnage to limit the number of cruisers to some, depending on the proposal, either similar parities levels to the battleships or to slightly modified parities, depending on the individual power's needs. However, according to the Washington Treaty, there was no actual limit on cruiser tonnage, just in terms of how many cruisers you could build, just a limit on the size and armament of individual cruisers. Now, obviously, that actually favoured Britain, because Britain needed a lot of cruisers to manage its empire. The fact that the government then refused to pay for large numbers of cruisers is an entirely different matter, but Beatty had managed to leave that option open to them if they'd chosen to exploit it. Robert Knapp asks, what is your assessment of the Fairey Fulmar? It feels unfairly bemoaned considering that it achieved the most kills of any fleet air-arm aircraft in the Second World War. Or is this just due to when it was the main fleet fighter, considering the vast superiority of its successors? I think the Fulmar does get a bit of an unfair rap. I've mentioned before repeatedly the fully adapted for naval service Sea Spitfire that was under development at the time of the beginning of the Second World War, and then obviously got canned because the RAF wanted all the Merlin engines and all the Spitfire airframes. And you have to consider it in this context. And again, I've posted a little table that I've done a couple of times before, which shows the state of Japanese, American, and British carrier aviation in 1939 when the war breaks out. And surprisingly, Britain is ahead when you look at who has the retractable undercarriage monoplane aircraft in the fighter, dive bomber, and torpedo bomber roles. It's got 2 out of the 3, whereas the other 2 navies only have 1 out of 3. But by late 1940, then going into 1941, and obviously at the end of 1941, Japan and the US get into World War II in a big way. By that point, everything has kind of flipped over in terms of capability. essentially because the US and Japan have had a couple of years of, relatively speaking, peacetime to continue developing their aircraft, whereas the Fleet Air Arm has had to basically slam in what it's got available, as well as having stuff that it wanted to get in hand cancelled because of wartime needs. And as a result, when you have a look and see Zeros and Wildcats compared to the Fulmar, sure, the Fulmar seems to lose out in the direct fighter-on-fighter comparisons, but the Fulmar was never really supposed to fulfill the same role as the Wildcat, especially, and to a certain extent the Zero. The Fulmar was supposed to be for fleet defense against long-range multi-engined bombers, which it did pretty well. The Regia Aeronautica can attest to that. And it was supposed to be for long-range recon and patrol, which it also did very well. And despite the fact that, yes, qualitatively it is inferior to a Wildcat or a Zero in a dogfight, or various land-based German and Italian fighters, as I've just covered, that's not really a huge surprise. What should have been contesting Axis fighters was the single-seat fighter the Fleet Air Arm asked for, with, according to the decisions that were being made in 1939, the Royal Navy's carriers would have been using Fulmars as, long-distance patrol and long-duration combat air patrol aircraft, which are primarily going after enemy strike aircraft, which, even against the Japanese, against Vals and Kates, the Fulmar actually did surprisingly well, just didn't do too well against the Zeros. And then you would have had single-seat fighters, which were coming in as the Royal Navy realised they might actually have to face off against such other aircraft, who would have dealt with those particular aircraft. And I think that probably would have worked out relatively well. I mean, you can question the doctrine as a whole, but broadly speaking, it's not an awful one, especially when you consider that obviously the Japanese and the Americans split their flight decks three ways between fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers in the first stages of World War II. The British, in part fair because they had slightly small air groups, but also in part because of just having a slightly different doctrine, were doing things slightly differently in that they tended to go for a combined role aircraft. So initially, you had the Skua and the Rock, or this, looking especially at the Skua, which was supposed to be a dive bomber and fighter at the same time. The Swordfish was a torpedo bomber primarily, but also could do the dive bombing role. So if the war had held off just a little bit, or the RF had been a little less stringent in its demands, Fleet Air Arm carrier groups in 1940 would probably have consisted of Swordfish and maybe the odd Albacore, which would be the strike aircraft capable of either bombing or torpedoing, and then a flight or so of Fulmars for your patrol, recon, fleet defense against spotters and bombers, etc., and then additional flights of your single-engine, single-seater fighters for general fleet defense against more agile aircraft. And it probably would have worked fairly well, I think, because one of the major problems that American and Japanese carriers had, even with the relatively long range of the Zeros, was having to constantly cycle your combat air patrol aircraft, which put strain on the aircraft and also made it something somewhat difficult to juggle that with getting your strikes landed and taken off. Whereas if you've got Fulmars that can just happily sit up there for ages doing general fleet defense, that means you can husband the landing cycles of the Fulmars, you can husband the quicker reacting single-seat fighters, and therefore your flight deck is also open for considerably more strike operations. But, essentially the Fulmar is, at least to my mind, a key element of a slightly different carrier doctrine that didn't work out, not necessarily because it was flawed, but because significant elements of that doctrine were never built thanks to the outbreak of World War II, which Britain got involved in from the start and therefore had an inherent disadvantage when compared to Japanese and American carrier arms going forward. Edward Olson asks, what made the World War I German raider Say Adler so successful? Wouldn't it be suspicious to see a sailing ship in the age of steam? the two main reasons for, say, Adler's success have to come down, one, to her crew and captain. Crew skill is a huge factor here. And secondly, to part of the reason that, say, Adler was even selected for service in the first place, namely that she didn't require fuel. The big problem that German plans for commerce raiding had run into was, well, the British had most of the couple of big coaling stations, and if they didn't, their allies did, and if they didn't, then the remaining coaling ports were mostly neutral, but with an awful lot of pressure being put on them by the British, which meant that opportunities for German surface raiders of the more modern type to refuel were very, very few and far between, especially as the various German colonial holdings started being taken out. And that meant that conventional surface raiding warfare was really in a bit of a sticky situation, whereas, say, Adler, as a sailing vessel, just could continue happily motoring on, or sailing on, as the case may be, which meant that her lifespan at sea, just because of her ability to propel herself via the wind, was considerably extended. Now, in terms of wouldn't it be suspicious to see a sailing ship in the Age of Steam? Not really. In World War I, there was still a huge number of merchant vessels out there that were wholly or primarily sail-powered. And they might have an auxiliary engine of some description, but, I mean, even if you just look at the list of prizes taken by, say, Adler, the vast majority of them are actually either sailing vessels flat out or sailing merchant ships with auxiliary engines. So the sight of another sailing merchant vessel floating around would be completely typical for general sea traffic in the World War I period. Plus, of course, a lot of the early German attempts at surface raiding had involved either armed merchant cruisers converted from ocean liners or, full-on warships, which meant that, mentally speaking, most captains, when they thought of a German raider, would be looking for some kind of motorized vessel rather than a sailing ship. So, additional layer of cover there. You've got to remember that, for example, at the Battle of the Falkland Islands a few years before, say, Adler set out on her raiding voyage, that had been not necessarily interrupted, but observed by a French sailing merchant ship that had wandered in and just gone, I didn't know there was a war on. Maybe it's time to skedaddle out of here because, survival chances not good. Eric Van Dooting asks, I've just finished reading Islands of Destiny by John Prados, and he notes that as late as November 1943, in one of the US air raids on Rabaul, only 2 of 50 torpedoes functioned properly. I'd thought that by then the US had solved their torpedo issues and had enough time to get new weapons shipped out to the front lines or perform field modifications on the ones that were already there. Could you discuss the timeline of this issue and extenuating circumstances such as attacking ships in a shallow harbour that might have added to these problems? The problem was that, as you probably have appreciated from both the Mark 14 video and the US Navy submarine campaign videos thus far, at the time this video goes out, US torpedoes had multiple layers of failure. So, with the Mark 14, some of the failures, including but not limited to the faulty magnetic detonator, but when you switched off that, it turned out the contact detonator didn't work particularly well, and when you tried to fix that, it turned out that the detonator could be just completely popped out of the torpedo upon impact, and then it turned out that the actual head of the torpedo was not strong enough, etc., 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 and you've got 3 primary torpedoes. Obviously, you've got some secondary ones like the Mark 10 used in the older US submarines, but you've got the Mark 14 and then later the Mark 18, but the Mark 14 in this time period primarily as the submarine launched torpedo. The Mark 18 has its own issues. You've got the Mark 15, which is the surface-launched torpedo, which has some problems similar to the Mark 14, but not all. And then you have the Mark 13, which is the US aerial torpedo, which has some related issues to the Mark 14, not that many, but it has a whole suite of other problems all of its own, primarily related to the combination of its size and shape, because if you look at British, Japanese, German, Italian aerial torpedoes, and you look at Mark 13, you'll notice the Mark 13 is a lot squatter, a lot of a shorter, stubbier looking weapon compared to everybody else's, which means it has some rather unique drop characteristics. It tends to be somewhat unstable in flight, and then as well, that compounded with various issues with drop doctrine, because it turns out, well, if you drop it too low and slow, which is what doctrine held you should do, it also had fragility issues, which was something that also plagued the Mark 18, and it could break just from basically belly slapping the water. Alternatively, if you went too fast, and let's face it, if you're a torpedo bomber pilot under enemy fire, chances are you're probably going to be going maybe a little bit faster than the paperwork says you technically should. Well, at that point, it being a relatively short weapon made it very unstable, and it would tend to tumble and hit the water at anything but the angle you wanted it to. And that meant that, the chances of the torpedo fully getting into the water and in a functional state in the direction you pointed it were relatively slim. And then even if it did get into that state, they found in various tests, some of them would sink, some of them would just go wandering off on their own direction, some would run deep, some would run shallow, some would just not engage, the motors wouldn't engage. A lot of these problems might be due to damage that was bad enough to compromise some of those features without destroying the torpedo entirely. And so there was a whole laundry list of issues that had to be fixed with the Mark 13. The main, well, not the main difference, but one of the big differences being, of course, that US subs were using the Mark 14 right from the word go consistently, and therefore had a lot more to say about the problem, whereas with the Mark 13, the aerial torpedo, whilst in individual battles or attacks you could have quite a lot of them dropped, those individual attacks could be spaced out over quite a distance of time, and obviously working out what exactly had gone wrong. If you've sent, let's say, 50 torpedo bombers out, how many of those were shot down, how many had to abort, how many drops could you attribute to them making the incorrect run, and of the torpedoes that actually hit the water, what percentage actually did damage. You'd have to wait for post-battle recon, which could take a while to figure out, were any of them hit, and if they were hit, how badly. If they weren't hit, was it because the aim was wrong, or was it because of a problem with the torpedo? There's just a lot more steps to actually working out, A, that there is a problem, and admittedly by 43 they did know there was a problem, and then B, finding out and fixing those problems, which they eventually did manage to do during the war. So the saga of terribleness for each of the US torpedoes it entered the war with is somewhat different, and the Mark 15, the American surface launch one, whilst it did have its own issues, was the least bad. The Mark 14 was pretty terrible. The Mark 13 had a list of issues almost as bad as the Mark 14, and to be honest, for that matter, the Mark 18, the main thing being that if the Mark 13 actually made it to the target, it would probably detonate, which was a little bit of a step up over the Mark 14 and the Mark 18, which in their worst states not only had major issues getting to the target in the first place, but if they did, they usually didn't detonate properly. Sergeant Schultz asks, regarding HMS Canopus around the time of the Battle of Coronel, what mechanical issues were caused or not prevented by the chief engineer's breakdown which led to Canopus's speed problems? And what accounts or reports let us know the engineer was having a nervous breakdown, and what happened to him? There were a few mechanical issues with Canopus's engines, but the vast majority of them were not actually present. So her engineering commander, who had the mental breakdown, he basically spent the entire voyage locked in his cabin. He had no idea what state the engines were in. For reference, when Canopus was brought out of reserve, she did some measured mile testing. So this is, somewhat, not a huge amount earlier, just the early part of 1914. And during her measured mile testing, she made at least 17.5 knots. There's some controversy over one particular reading, which could either read 13.5 or 18.5 knots, but either way, she was, even if you discount that higher possibility, she was capable of making over 17.5 knots at the time of her recommissioning. And while she'd sailed a reasonable distance since then, your engines don't degrade from doing 17.5 knots to 12 knots that quickly. But of course, if your chief engineer is locked himself away in his cabin and refuses to even so much as look at the engines, all sorts of things are going to be made up. One of the main things that's cited in the reports that said Canopus could only do 12 knots was apparently she had faulty condensers. Well, apparently not, because once the chief engineer was relieved and what repairs did need to be done were taken over by one of his subordinates, if you look at the location that Canopus was at when she received word that Craddock's squadron had been destroyed, and then you look at her logs, and from where she is at the time when she turns round and heads back home, heads towards the Falkland Islands, chart her course, and then look at the time that she gets into Stanley, and factor in, obviously, that some of that was navigating through some fairly nasty, very narrow straits, and went through some fairly rough weather as well, during which time, obviously, in both of those cases, her speed would be limited. And then look at the time, look at the distance, and you work out her average speed, and you realise that on her way back, there is absolutely no way her maximum speed was limited to 12 knots. She was making considerably more than that, otherwise she physically would not have been able to get back to the Falklands at the time that she did. We have accounts from the captain of Canopus. He actually wrote a book about his experiences in World War I. They tell us that the engineer had a breakdown. We also have the records of the commander, Denbo, because he was invalided out of the Royal Navy as a result, so they had to do a full assessment of him for that. And, well, that answers the last part of your question. What happened to the Royal Navy? Went, look, this man is clearly ill. He's not fit for his station, and he was invalided out of the Navy. I suppose in US terms, that might be considered an honourable discharge on grounds of sickness or something like that. So, as it turned out, Canopus was, whilst not capable of her original design speed, certainly capable of getting within a couple of knots of it. And when you account for the speed of the Otranto and the fact that Graf Spee's squadron, or von Spee's squadron, was reduced in speed from its theoretical maximum because of fouling of the engines and fouling of the hull, whilst Canopus would have been a minor drag on Craddock's squadron, she almost certainly would have been truly capable of speeds of about the same as that which Otranto was capable of doing, because bearing in mind Otranto theoretically could do 18 knots, the same that Canopus could have done when she was first built, but fouling, time, and wear on her engines meant that Otranto definitely wasn't doing 18 knots at the time of Coronel. And you have additional circumstantial evidence of the fact there wasn't a huge amount wrong with her machinery, because when, obviously, she's at the Battle of the Falklands grounded as a coastal defence battery, but afterwards she refloats herself and doesn't go in to refit her engines. She just goes back to patrol off South America and is then reassigned to the Mediterranean, where she takes part in the attacks on the Dardanelles Straits, bombarding various Ottoman positions. She doesn't actually go in for any kind of refit, despite being, on, as I said, general patrol duty, which requires your engines to work, and then attacking the Dardanelles, which also requires your engines to work, until May, June in 1915. And that is partly because, obviously, of all the wear and tear and counterfire from the Ottomans. And then when she goes in to Malta for a refit, it only lasts from the very, very end of May, because at the 25th of May 1915 is when she leaves the Dardanelles, and she's done by the end of June. And I'm sorry, but if your engines were really in that bad a state, half a year earlier, in the South Pacific, and you haven't had a chance for a refit, you've grounded the ship, you've gone on patrol, you've then sailed to the Mediterranean, you've fought in the Dardanelles engagement, you're like, even if the engines were worn enough just to be capable of 12 knots, you would have needed more than a month in Malta to make good on that. The fact that she went through all of that and then only spent a month in Malta tells you that, yeah, there was nothing majorly wrong with her engines. There are a few details of the specific things that needed to be fixed once her chief engineer was removed from his position, but they were relatively minor things that very quickly resulted in Canopus being able to do, as I mentioned, a reasonably decent turn of speed. Yokosuka Girls Maritime High School Training Vessel Harakaze asks, what was the first occasion that ship-carried aircraft, and solely those aircraft, sank a ship in action and not in testing, and what, perversely, was the first time a ship's defences shot down an aircraft, and what were the reactions on both sides at the time? Well, depending on how you count the particulars of the attack, a short 184, like this one shown here, in 1915 torpedoed and sank a Turkish or Ottoman freighter, and the aircraft was deployed from the seaplane carrier technically aircraft carrying vessel HMS Ben Maishri, converted ferry if my memory serves. So technically speaking, that is a ship carrying aircraft. The aircraft that it launches, and solely that aircraft, has launched a torpedo at a vessel, which has then been sunk. So I guess that would be the first combat, if you like, use of an aircraft to sink a ship, albeit there was some argument over whether a submarine was involved as well, but typically this is considered the first one. As far as aircraft destroyed by ship's defences, I'm not 100% sure on this one, but I do know that the L7, a Zeppelin, was shot down in early May 1916 by ships of the Royal Navy, so that would probably be a fairly strong contender for earliest aircraft destroyed by ships' anti-aircraft weapons, because it's within, a year or so of the introduction of anti-aircraft weapons, and, well, frankly, hitting a massive airship is probably a lot easier than hitting a small aircraft. There were, of course, a lot of aircraft that had been shot down by early anti-aircraft guns before that, when those anti-aircraft guns are land-based, but I think that's probably the first time an aircraft of some description is shot down by a warship, but if you know differently, please feel free to mention it in the comments below. Rande Topeka asks, in the wake of the fall of the battleship in World War II, many battleship classes were being decommissioned wholesale very early in their lives. Was there any other time in history when relatively new and modern ships or ship types were decommissioned because they suddenly found themselves obsolete? Yep, there are a few. The end of World War I is another good example. Now, obviously, partly that's because of the Washington Treaty that follows a few years later. But if you look at the history of, quite a few destroyers and cruisers that were built post-1910, so they're less than 10 years old by 1920, and, Arethusa class and Town class, for example, in the UK, they're all being sold for scrap within 10 years of them being built. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with them. Okay, they might be a bit worn through war use, but when you compare them with the cruiser and destroyer fleets of various competitor navies, they're still competitive vessels. They're just decided to be obsolete partly by advancements, mass production, things like the C-class, and partly by massive cost cutting. But in terms of true obsolescence, probably the best thing to look at is the start of the ironclad era, because as we know, ships like HMS Victory, HMS Royal Sovereign, the big ships of the line, they could typically expect to have service lives measured in multiple decades. 20 to 30 years would be fairly young for a first rate to be broken up. Victory was being considered for being broken up, but when she was over 40, but then was, refitted, rebuilt, and served at Trafalgar, and obviously went on for a bit longer as well. So you're talking about, on average, a 30 to 40 year lifespan for a typical ship of the line. And then you look at the ships of the line that were being built in the 1850s, and then along comes HMS Warrior and ironclad battleships, and suddenly there's a whole swathe of ships of the line that are essentially being decommissioned and either sold for breaking up or taken off for ancillary purposes like training ships or accommodation hulks, again, within a decade of their being launched, which is practically unheard of prior to that for something that's that big and costs that much to build. Wisdom in the Shadows asks, why, in almost every battle they're in, does the American Navy seem to be both mouth-foamingly angry and underpants-on-head insane compared with other great navies? When faced with being outgunned against greater numbers or with odds weighed against them, they just seem to fight and win all the harder. From John Paul Jones to the Barbary Coast, then all the way through to Taffy 3, it seems the more insane the situation, the better they perform. Well, I would, of course, point out it's not a universal trend. So when you look at conflicts, like even the War of 1812, a very glorified conflict in American naval circles, and yeah, to an extent rightly so, they did have quite a few notable victories, but when you look at the history of the 6 frigates, those 6 frigates spent an awful lot of the War of 1812 hiding away in port because they were massively outnumbered and outgunned, and frankly, they weren't stupid. So, yes, a big heavy American frigate might outgun a regular Royal Navy frigate, but then when there are 6 or 7 of them and a Razzé or a third-rate ship of the line off the coast, the War of 1812 US captains weren't dumb enough to try and take on those odds, with 1 or 2 exceptions, which usually ended very badly for the frigate in question. But I do get your general point in that when you look at quite a number of conflicts the US Navy fights during the period the Channel covers, they do seem to have quite a crop of rather aggressive commanders, whether that be Manila Bay or Farragut's damn the torpedoes full speed ahead, Samar, etc., as you mentioned. My personal theory on this is that this is one of, if possibly maybe the only benefit of Congress being as parsimonious as they are historically for most of the time period the Channel covers, i.e., for the vast majority of that time period, the US Navy functions in a state of fighting for its very existence against Congress and being cut down massively during peacetime, and then come wartime, suddenly the floodgates open and large numbers of ships are constructed. Now, in that vein, of course, if you suddenly start mass producing large numbers of ships, you also need to bring in large numbers of men and get them trained up pretty quickly, and the ones that you have already trained, you can't really afford to be playing favourites with. War of 1812. Suddenly, with the Royal Navy showing up in large numbers, especially towards the end of it, the US Navy has to go with not just its professional officer corps from previously, but, lower ranking officers are being elevated to higher ranks, and people who weren't previously naval officers are being commissioned. American Civil War, again, the Union Navy, and for that matter the Confederate Navy, has to expand massively, the Union Navy considerably more so. So once again, officers are being promoted a lot faster than they would have been historically, and new blood is being brought in. Spanish-American War, pretty much the same, although at a slightly slower pace. And for the limited involvement of World War I, and to a certain extent World War II, because although in World War II the US Navy starts out being relatively large, it grows to truly colossal sizes, which again means relatively fast-track promotions, along with a rather Darwinian 1942. So all of this, I think, adds up to a lot of the time when you look at other navies that are fairly large and go into a war fairly large, there's a degree of ossification that's gone on. Very large officer corps, you've got a very wide range of quality, and the ones that have been in service the longest, they may not necessarily be the most competent, but they choose to stay in place, and so you get a little bit of a mixed bag. And because of this rather large inertia, you end up with junior officers staying as junior officers for considerable portions of time. Whereas for the US Navy, those possibly younger, not necessarily always younger, but lower ranked, at least, officers who are very inventive, have a fair bit to prove, and obviously appreciate the fact that they are being promoted quite rapidly, and therefore are more likely to be quite aggressive, quite forward, and quite willing to engage in battle no matter the odds, are probably statistically more likely to actually end up being given commands of ships and thrown into whatever war the US is currently involved in. Essentially, a lot of people who end up in command of US ships during the time period the channel covers, in the event of war, are probably people who, in the normal course of things, would gradually have some of that aggression and occasional insanity beaten out of them by the long, slow grind up towards higher rank, but they're circumventing that, and thus they're bringing that sort of, if you like, fresh perspective to combat in somewhat greater proportions than you would find with some other navies. Architect 096 asks, the economics of capital ships during the World War I and World War II periods. How big of a GDP does a nation need to have to be able to field and sustain at least a squadron of 4 battleships or battle cruisers with the proper escorts without bankrupting itself? And what were the costs associated with keeping a fleet operational once the ships were already in service? Now, as I mentioned in the first half, I think, of this dry dock, the maintenance cost to keep a fleet operational are a very difficult thing to calculate on average, because you might have ships in reserve, in which case they're going to need less maintenance. You have them on very active frontline service, they need more maintenance, and so on and so forth. But costs associated, obviously you've got manpower costs to pay the men aboard the ships, provisions to feed them, general spare parts, because things will always break, periodic dry dockings and refittings of the ship. So then those will be 2 separate items, because the dry dockings, technically speaking, could be just for regular maintenance, periodically for big issues, and then that will have a fixed cost associated with it. But then you might also, in refits, be introducing new fire control equipment, better engines, etc. All of that's got costs associated. You've got to keep the ship painted, de-rusted, occasionally replacing decking, wear and tear on internal components, uniforms, hammocks, relatively minor stuff, all the way up to glass windows and hinges and things like that. And obviously the consumables the ship itself uses, fuel, lubricating oil, etc. So that there's quite a lot that goes into it, and that's without going into the shore-based stuff you have to maintain. But if you want to, let's say, have a squadron of 4 capital ships, using World War I as an example, a squadron of 4 battleships, purchase cost-wise, you're probably looking at about £8 million. A bit more if you go for battle cruisers, or you go for something like a Queen Elizabeth, it's probably going to be close to 10. But if you're going for a more regular capital ship, you're probably looking at around 8 million English pounds, British pounds. The escorts, assuming that you have let's say a dozen destroyers and a few cruisers, you're probably looking at least doubling that. You can look at the proposed fleet unit costs that were being bandied around, and that only involves a single capital ship. So factoring in for submarines some additional destroyers, because you want to be able to rotate them, and a couple of extra cruisers, you're probably looking at a flat purchase price of, I would say, about 25 to 30 million pounds if you want to have a fully kitted out fleet centered around 4 capital ships. Now, the build times for that, obviously the longest is going to be the capital ships, but on average, you're spreading these costs out over about 3 years. So even if you went all singing, all dancing, and you went for 30 million, you're looking at having a sustained expenditure of about 10 million pounds per year in order to build them. Obviously, the maintenance costs are going to be somewhat reduced, and then you'd hope, certainly compared to that. And, you don't necessarily have to have 10 million up front per year to out of your GDP. You do need 10 million upfront to pay for the ships to be built, but if this is going to be your brand new navy, you could save up a little bit if you like. So if we're generous and we say that you're saving for 3 years, or maybe you're taking loans deferred for 3 years, so you only need to come up with 5 million per year to actually build and construct your ships. That seems relatively reasonable to build your fleet. So that's your high watermark, if you like, before, and then your maintenance stuff is all going to be less than that. So if you can afford 5 million a year, everything else follows. Now, if we assume, again, we're looking at a World War I example, that let's say half your defense budget is going to your navy and the other half is going to your army and maybe a nascent air force. So that means that you have absolute minimum a defense budget of 10 million a year during the years that you're building your ships, which, as we said, is our high watermark. And then we can look at that and say, okay, well, somewhere between 3 and 4% of GDP is a typical defense budget for nations prior to World War One. So, for example, the UK was spending just over 3.15% of GDP in 1914 before World War One kicked off. So let's say this is costing us 3 1/3% GDP, because it makes it easier to calculate. So 10 million represents 3 1/3 of our GDP. So that means 30 million represents 10% of our GDP, which means our total GDP for those years is going to need to be £300 million. Now, annoyingly, most GDP figures for 1914 are in dollars, but we know that it's just under $5 to the pound in 1914, which would then mean that our notional £300 million GDP is going to become, since 5 multiplied by 3 is 15, and then it's a little bit under 5. We're so going to need about $1.3 to $1.4 billion per year as our GDP. And that would suggest that the combined GDP of something like Portugal and her colonies would be sort of the lowest threshold. Somewhere like Romania is just a little bit short, about 10 to 20% short. Brazil's GDP actually indicates they can afford it, although of course that's not accounting for the economic instability that was going on at the time in that area. And of course that's assuming that we're spending a percent of GDP similar to what Britain is spending, but hopefully that gives you some idea. Onboard G1 asks, I visited the Scottish National Museum of Flight at East Fortune today and learned the fascinating history of how the base was used in the First World War to trial the earliest torpedo bombers for strikes against the High Seas Fleet, including flying aircraft from HMS Argus based in the Forth. Could you tell us a bit more about this early experimentation with carrier strike aircraft and maybe speculate about how such an attack would have played out if it had happened? So the aircraft in question was the Sopwith Cuckoo, as can be seen here, one of the world's first purpose-built, purpose-designed torpedo bombers. And yes, the East Fortune Airbase was precisely where the Cuckoo was first trialled. The idea the Royal Navy had come up with was to take its extremely weird and wonderful collection of aircraft carrying vessels, everything from Furious, Argus, when they planned to take when she commissioned, various smaller aircraft carrier type vessels, and then, as I said, also aircraft carrying vessels. And between them, the idea was to carry a bunch of Cuckoos close enough to Wilhelmshaven to launch a mass torpedo strike on the High Seas Fleet at anchor. And if you think Pearl Harbor was bad, bear in mind that at Pearl Harbor, both the Japanese first and second waves combined between them only had about 40 torpedo bombers carrying actual torpedoes, whereas the maximal Royal Navy version for attacking Wilhelmshaven was 120 Cuckoos. So 3 times as many torpedo bombers as were present at Pearl Harbor. Now, granted, obviously they weren't going to send in level bombers or dive bombers, but then again, the Vals didn't do a huge amount at Pearl Harbor. Okay, granted, the converted shells from some of the B-5s did, like with Arizona, but 3 times as many torpedoes. And of course, you don't need fighters because, unlike Pearl Harbor, there isn't really any fighter defences for Wilhelmshaven. There's no radar, etc. And, of course, there's also not really all that much in the terms of anti-aircraft batteries around Wilhelmshaven. There's some anti-aircraft guns on the fleet, but, is the fleet going to be ready and able to man them quickly enough, and are they going to be in any way, shape or form effective, given that this is going to be a surprise attack if it works out properly? So over at East Fortune was where the Cuckoo was put through its paces, and the main reason the attack wasn't launched in 1918, which is when they wanted to, was simply because Sopwith couldn't produce enough Cuckoos in time. And so they decided, okay, well, let Sopwith build up the number of Cuckoos over the winter, and we'll go in spring 1919, although then, of course, by spring 1919, the armistice was in place, and so they couldn't. I am planning at some point in the future to do a video that goes into more detail about the preparation for this operation, and then hypothetically wargaming out what could have happened in the event of the attack. But the problem is I'm going to need to do a lot more work on that before, because I've vaguely speculated about this before, but as I pointed out in those previous speculations, the problem is that on the one hand, it has a potential to be massively more destructive than Pearl Harbor. As I said, essentially no anti-aircraft defenses, 3 times as many torpedoes in the water, German capital ships, cruisers, etc. do not have anything close to the amount of torpedo defenses that the US battleships had at Pearl Harbor. Obviously, it didn't do ships like West Virginia all that much good, but it's not going to take as many torpedo hits to down a German ship at the end of World War I as it would to down a standard battleship in 1941. The High Seas Fleet anchorage is considerably larger and more open than Battleship Row at Pearl Harbor, which is going to give the Cuckoos considerably more time to make sure their approaches are nice, straight and level. So all of these factors would seem to indicate that the attack could be completely devastating for the High Seas Fleet, an order of magnitude or worse than Pearl Harbor was for the US fleet. But on the other hand, you have the fact that the torpedoes themselves are somewhat less capable than the Japanese Type 91s. You have the fact that, well, the Cuckoo is still a slow biplane. It's a little bit more fragile than a Kate, so if there's poor weather, that could affect things. How much, if any, torpedo netting is present in the harbour? Where is it? Can the torpedoes be dropped inside it? Can the torpedoes be made to break the nets? All of this needs to be worked out. What happens if they get some warning? If somebody spots the Cuckoos coming over the coastline, or spots the Royal Navy fleet? There's as not quite as many, but almost as many factors which could mitigate the effect of the strike as there are in favour of making the strike much, much worse than Pearl Harbor was. And so, as I said, considerably more work, and I think second and third opinions from other historians is going to have to go into making that particular video. And I'm sure whatever solution-suggestion we arrive at, someone's going to disagree anyway, because that's just the nature of these kinds of things. Sage of Irrelevance asks, during World War II, how did U-boats interact with German surface raiders? Were there attempts to coordinate attacks on convoys? Did friendly fire incidents occur? And what measures were in place to prevent such incidents? I'm not aware of any friendly fire incidents between U-boats and Hilfskreuzer, and I'm also not aware of any specific attempts to coordinate attacks on convoys, and that is in large part because the targets for the Hilfskreuzer and the targets for the U-boats are very different, as are mostly the operational theatres. The majority, although not all, U-boats concentrated on the merchant trade in the North Atlantic. Relatively few U-boats could be found going after trade in the South Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, or, to be honest, even the Mediterranean. There were some, but those areas were a lot less heavily trafficked by U-boats. Conversely, Hilfskreuzer virtually never stayed for any long period of time in the North Atlantic. They obviously had to pass through it, but generally Hilfskreuzer operated everywhere but the North Atlantic, as I said, except for short periods. And that's because the U-boats, for them, attacking convoys was the best thing they could do because, well, one, that's where the merchant ships were for the most part in the North Atlantic, and secondly, obviously, that's where there's a majority of targets. If you pop your periscope up and there's 2 dozen, 3 dozen merchant ships to choose from, you've got options, and if you succeed in one attack, you can then go after another and another and another. But that exact target is absolute suicide for a Hilfskreuzer because most merchant vessels have some kind of armament, not huge amount, but a little, even if it's an obsolete little 4-inch pop gun. And of course, when you look at Liberty ships, they come pre-designed with a reasonable cadre of weapons for a merchant vessel. Plus, the convoy has escorts of varying descriptions, which means that even if the Hilfskreuzer in question is individually superior to the armament of any given merchant vessel, and potentially even technically superior to the armament of some of the escorts, it'll just get mobbed. And, of course, the other thing is, if a convoy is happily patrolling, the escorts patrolling the merchant ships are in the convoy, in the North Atlantic, if a random lone merchant ship wanders up out of the murk and tries to approach the convoy, that is incredibly suspicious. And the chances are the Hilfskreuzer will be ID'd and taken out long before it gets near the convoy, whereas out in the more open waters of other oceans, one merchant ship coming across another merchant ship at random is much less suspicious. And of course, one-on-one, normally, the merchant ship doesn't stand much of a chance. Of course, one of the German Hilfskreuzer was sunk in a mutually destructive engagement with the Liberty ship, but there you go. Plus, of course, if they did try and coordinate attacks on convoys, i.e. the U-boats and the Hilfskreuzer going after the convoy at the same time, there's a very, very high chance of friendly fire then actually occurring, because, well, a merchant ship is a merchant ship is a merchant ship. If you're close enough to recognise exactly which flag it's flying as a U-boat commander, you've probably done something horribly wrong. So the main measure to prevent incidents between the Hilfskreuzer and the U-boats was just for them not to be in the same vicinity as each other for the most part. And, of course, U-boats would be given the profiles of Hilfskreuzer if they were assigned to those more distant stations. However, that didn't mean there was no interaction at all. This photo of Cormoran is taken from a U-boat. So the Hilfskreuzer would be stocked with U-boat spare parts, torpedoes compatible with U-boats, and, of course, lots and lots of supplies. And on occasion, Hilfskreuzer would be directed to specific rendezvous with certain U-boats to essentially top up those U-boats and very occasionally allow for the transfer of prisoners or sick or injured men off of the U-boats. But those were very carefully choreographed and set up meetings, usually in completely dead areas of ocean and well away from any potential hunting grounds, again, just as a matter of a safety precaution. Wyoming Iceberg asks, taking note of the Thanksgiving holiday, which is occurring around about this period, were there special meals or celebrations practiced by the various navies, like the American practice of a special Thanksgiving meal, besides Christmas, as that's likely common and nearly universal amongst most navies? There are a few. I mean, it depends on the navy, obviously. Some navies will celebrate their nation's Independence Day, or some other similar founding or refounding event. So in the Royal Navy, obviously, you've got Trafalgar Night, Pickle Night for that matter as well. Semi-irregularly, if you have a special occasion like the coronation of a new monarch. The French, the Marine Nationale, I rather suspect have some rather special things going on for Bastille Day, although of course they don't call it Bastille Day. But I cannot for the life of me remember whether July is pronounced Juliette or Guillet or something like that in French, so I'm not going to try and pronounce the whole thing. I know it's Le 14 of July. Yeah, I can't remember how to pronounce July in French. It's been a while since I did French GCSEs. Back in the old Spanish Armada, as in the Age of Sail Spanish Armada, Spain still is to a certain degree a highly Catholic country, but back then it was a really, really Catholic country, so there were all sorts of saints' days, feast days, holy days, obviously, Easter, etc., that they would celebrate in addition to Christmas. Andronor asks, with the Royal Navy being so dominant following World War I and through the interwar years, why didn't their potential adversaries create some sort of naval air arm in large numbers to defeat the Royal Navy? Well, to be fair, some people did try, but again, Billy Mitchell's test to the contrary, frankly, for most of the interwar period, aircraft just weren't really up to all that much when it came to anti-shipping work. In the early to mid-1920s, and to a certain extent, like with some aircraft, even the late 1920s, given that you don't have usually airfields positioned directly on the cliffs over your coastline, they're set a little bit back, and also the fact you have to think about running up and down the coastline, not just going straight out away from the coastline. Most land-based bombers, even big ones, like twin-engine ones, like this MB-1 here, only had an effective range of maybe 50, going up to maybe 150 miles towards the end of the decade, away from the coast. Or, as Royal Navy warships would call it, about 3 to 4 hours steaming, and that's right up to the coast, assuming you could actually find the Royal Navy ships, and assuming that you were within about, let's say, averaging out 100 miles of the airbase in question. Because, of course, if you have a very long coastline and you've got a squadron of specially trained anti-shipping bombers in one place and the Royal Navy is 200 miles up the coast, well, you might as well not have those aircraft because they ain't getting anywhere close to the Royal Navy in time. And the situation isn't massively improved in the early 1930s. I mean, a lot of these bombers, whether they're dropping bombs or using torpedoes, to be perfectly honest, in a particularly strong storm, particularly high winds, you might end up with a situation similar to that which some Albacores faced even in World War II when they were chasing Tirpitz, which was between the headwind and the fact that the ship they were targeting in question was steaming into that headwind. Their net closing speed was actually so pedestrian that they could be overtaken by a particularly swift destroyer, which was not a particularly pleasant experience. And the carrying capacity of a lot of these aircraft was, again, frankly, terrible. So for the majority of the 20s and 30s, you could build the biggest air force you could possibly want, but the chances were you probably couldn't find a Royal Navy task force. If you could find them, you probably weren't in range with your bombers. If you were in range, there was a very good chance you may not be able to catch them. And even if you did manage to find them, were in range, managed to get to them, well, the Royal Navy has some aircraft carriers with fighters who will probably be perfectly happy to tangle with your big, slow biplanes and early monoplane bombers, at which point, it's a huge and complicated investment that probably isn't going to result in anything. It's only once you get towards the latter part of the 1930s, especially with torpedo bombers, and maybe one or two of the dive bombers that can drop some particularly heavy bombs, that you actually really start to get a meaningful, long-range, high-capacity anti-shipping capability. And at that point, obviously, aircraft have become quite expensive, and so only a very, very few navies can invest in them. Obviously, some do, the Japanese and the Americans. Others try, but, at that point, the reason that the aircraft have become so lethal is because technology is advancing very quickly again, which means that you could spend thousands, hundreds of millions, depending on your local currency of whatever your currency is, on a fleet of bombers, only to find that in 3 or 4 years, they're hopelessly obsolete, and you might as well have not bothered starting over. I mean, this is, as I believe I mentioned on occasion, this is actually, in my opinion, one of the major problems that the Italian Air Force, the Regia Aeronautica, faces in World War II. Yes, people can wrangle them and say, oh yeah, look, they had a bunch of obsolete aircraft and, okay, they came out with some decent ones towards the end of their involvement in the war, but that their starting lineup really wasn't that great. Yeah, you can make that argument. However, I would make the argument, looking at the aircraft that equipped the various air forces throughout the 1930s, that if there was one major mistake the Regia Aeronautica made, it was modernising too early, because you tend to modernise in cycles unless you have truly absurd amounts of industry. So you'll have a bunch of aircraft, you go, right, these are obsolete, we need to do a wholesale replacement, fighters, bombers, transports, recon, etc., etc., and we're going to replace them with this new generation of modern types. And the Italians do, in fact, do that. They just do it, what turns out to be, for World War II, a couple of years too early. So they enter the war with aircraft that are just a little bit behind the curve, and then the really good competitive stuff that you see them introduce in 1940, 41, 42, that's the stuff that would have been the next generational wholesale shift up a technological level. But introducing those is somewhat restricted because, hey, there's an entire war on, so that kind of throttles them a bit. A little bit like, in some respects, how the Fleet Air Arm was, again, planning to do massive modernisations of its air fleet in 1939 and 1940 and got its knees somewhat cut off by the outbreak of war. And that brings us to the end of this month's Dry Dock. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening, if indeed you still are. And a little bit of good news for those of you who have reached the very end is that there was a bit of delay, mostly thanks to the illness, which hopefully with this second course of antibiotics I am now recovering from, which will allow me to restart the live streams fairly soon. But in any case, the artwork for the I Survived the Dry Dock medals - t-shirts - certificates, whatever form they're going to end up in, is finally done, and it's going off for proofing pretty soon. So with apologies for the slight delay, hopefully by the time we do this again, the Patreon Dry Dock, I'll be able to say, hey, here's the special I Survived the Dry Dock stuff. Which should be good. I'm looking forward to it anyway. In any case, thanks very much for listening, everyone. At the end of this 5 and bit hours worth of content for today, and see you again in another video.